Tuesday, a quiet morning. Christian Blake, always impeccably dressed, entered his corporate office. His blue eyes, usually cold, swept across the lobby. In business circles, Christian was known as precise, dispassionate, and unapproachable. Respected by some, feared by others, but dared by no one to approach. However, that morning marked the beginning of change. As he walked through the marble lobby, Christian saw a little girl quietly sitting on the floor by the reception desk. She was about 5 or 6, with long blonde hair curling at the ends and wearing a white, slightly crumpled dress. Over it, she had a denim jacket, a bit too large, and in her hands, a small backpack with cartoon stars and glitter. Her sneakers were scuffed, but it wasn't them that struck him. It was her face. The girl's eyes were wide open and the same piercing blue as his own. She wasn't crying or making a sound, just sitting as if waiting for something or someone. No one in the building seemed to notice her. Christian stopped, something clenching in his chest. He slowly knelt down and tried to smile. "Hi, are you lost?" The girl looked up and calmly, with absolute seriousness, replied, "Where can I buy a daddy?" For a moment, he was taken aback. "Sorry, what did you say?" he asked again, softer this time. She looked directly at him and repeated, "I want to buy a daddy. I've been saving coins, I need—" Christian's throat went dry. He handled multi-billion-dollar deals, hostile takeovers and lawsuits, but faced with a child asking to buy a father, he didn't know what to say. Then something inside him shifted. He looked at her again, not just at her words, but at the quiet determination in her eyes. This wasn't a tantrum or a prank. She had come here with a purpose. In the ensuing silence, he heard his own voice. "I can be him for free." The girl didn't even smile, just reached out, wrapped her hand around his index finger and said, "Okay, but if you're my daddy, you have to help mommy. She's sick, and we don't have money." That's when his heart finally broke. The entire room froze as he stood up, still holding her hand. For the first time in many years, Christian Blake walked away from board meetings and the perfectly structured life he had created. He allowed the child to lead him, step by step, out of the building, onto the sidewalk, and into the unknown. The drive across the city was slow. Christian Blake sat in the back seat, his driver glancing in the rearview mirror but saying nothing. Beside him sat the girl, her small hand still gripping his finger tightly. She didn't say much, her eyes fixed on the window, watching the streets change from gleaming glass towers to old brick buildings and faded storefronts. Her name, he learned, was Lily. When he gently asked where they were going, she replied home and rattled off an address unfamiliar to Christian. The driver knew the address. It was one of the poorest areas of the city, a place Christian hadn't been to since he was a teenager. As they turned onto a cracked side street, something resonated within him. This neighborhood stirred an old memory. Not just familiarity with the place, but the possibility of what he might find at the end of this road. He looked at Lily more closely. Her hair, her eyes, her voice, it all seemed strangely familiar, like an echo from a life he had long locked away. They pulled up to a 2-story building with peeling paint and a rusty staircase. Lily hopped out of the car and tugged his hand. "This way," she said, already ascending the steps. Christian followed her down a narrow hallway, smelling of dampness and old carpet. She stopped at a door on the second floor, pulled a key from her small backpack, and opened it. Inside, the apartment was dim and quiet. A few toys were scattered on the floor, and a folded blanket lay on the worn sofa. The kitchen was clean but empty. The walls were adorned with old photographs and children's drawings, obviously made by a child's hand. And there, on a futon by the far window, lay a woman. Christian's heart nearly stopped. She looked up as the door creaked open, and for a moment didn't say a word. Her face had changed, grown thin and pale, but her eyes were the same, hazel brown, wide with surprise, and something deeper. She tried to push herself up, but her body was clearly weakened. When she spoke, her voice was faint. "Christian." He couldn't answer for a long time, just stood there staring at her, stunned and breathless. Carefully, he moved closer. "Sophia," he said, almost a whisper. She nodded slowly, and a tear rolled down her cheek. "Are you really here?" He sank into a chair by her bed, still trying to process what he was seeing. The girl Lily stood nearby, watching both of them, confused by the silence. Sophia reached out a trembling hand and brushed a strand of hair from her face. "I didn't think I'd ever see you again," she said softly. "How is this possible? Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. "I didn't know how." Her voice trembled. "You went to London, changed numbers, disappeared. No calls, no letters, nothing. I was scared, and then it was too late when I realized I was pregnant." She paused, swallowing with difficulty. "I didn't want to ruin your life." Christian looked at Lily again. She was now sitting on the floor, quietly pulling a toy from her bag. "She's mine, isn't she?" Sophia nodded. The words hit him like a tsunami. He had a daughter who had walked into his office and asked to buy a daddy, a daughter who had grown up without him, with a woman he had once loved and somehow lost. He sprang up, overcome with emotion, and began pacing the small room. "How long have you been sick?" "More than a year," she replied. "First it was fatigue, dizziness. Then they found a tumor." "You didn't ask for help?" "I didn't think you'd care." Christian stopped. Those words hurt the most. "I always cared," he said. "I always thought of you." Sophia closed her eyes, trying not to cry. "I couldn't find you, and even if I could, you were so far from this life. I didn't think you'd even remember me." Christian returned to the chair and sat down heavily. He looked at her, truly looked, and saw not just a sick woman, but one who had fought for survival for years, one who had raised their child alone, one he had left, and no, only he. "I'm here now," he said, "and I'm not leaving." Sophia turned away. "She doesn't know everything, only that her daddy wasn't around." "She knows more than you think," he replied. "She came looking for me." They sat in silence for a long time, broken only by Lily's quiet humming in the corner. Christian reached out and gently took Sophia's hand. It was cold and fragile, but she didn't pull it away. "You need help? Real help?" "Not this," he said, looking around the apartment. "You're coming with me, both of you." "I can't just leave. I have bills, treatment. I'll take care of everything." Sophia looked at him, squinting. "Why?" "Because I should have been there," he replied, "and because I won't let my daughter lose her mother. Not after all this." She didn't say anything, but this time, when he stood up and gently lifted her from the bed, she didn't resist. And as he carried her out of the apartment, Lily followed, skipping with joy, not understanding the full depth of what had happened, but knowing with childlike simplicity that something had changed, something important, something good. Christian didn't take Sophia and Lily to his glass and steel penthouse above the city. He understood that it would be wrong. That place, though impressive, was cold, precise, and too sterile for a woman battling illness and for a child who still carried a plush rabbit with a torn ear. Instead, he took them to his private estate outside the city, a quiet place surrounded by trees and gentle hills, with wide windows that let in sunlight and a fireplace that had only been lit a couple of times in the last 10 years. It had stood empty for a long time, intended for weekends that never came. But now, it seemed like the only place that made sense. As they entered through the side door, Christian watched Lily's eyes widen. She didn't run or shout like other children might, just watched everything intently. The grand wooden staircase, the quiet hum of the ventilation, the scent of lemon polish and cedar. She held her mother's hand until they reached the guest bedroom, where the bed was made with soft sheets Christian had asked the housekeeper to put out that morning. Sophia, still weak and pale, slowly sat on the edge of the bed. Gratitude was etched on her face, but also doubt, as if she didn't know how to accept such help. Christian knelt before her, placing a hand on her knee. "You'll stay here as long as you need. Doctors will come. Everything is under control. You don't have to fight alone anymore." She looked at him, exhausted, but with a spark in her eyes. "I'm not used to someone doing things for me." "I know," he said. "Let me do it." She nodded slowly, and her shoulders relaxed enough to show she trusted him, at least for now. That evening, Christian sat in his study, quietly watching the monitor from the camera as Lily curled up next to her mother on the guest bed. He hadn't spoken to anyone all day about what had happened. No meetings, no calls, not even emails. His assistant Grace had sent him over a dozen messages, but he let them pile up. For the first time in years, work no longer mattered. He kept thinking about Lily's voice asking where she could buy a daddy. He had built a world so distant from children, emotions, and unpredictability that now, faced with all three, he didn't recognize himself, but he liked who he was becoming. Later that night, after Lily had fallen asleep, Sophia sat next to Christian by the fireplace. A blanket was draped over her shoulders, and a cup of warm tea was in her hands. Her voice was quiet, almost fearful, as if she was afraid of what would come next. "I didn't know if I should tell her who you were. I thought maybe I'd missed my chance." "You didn't miss it," Christian replied. "She found me before you and I had any chance at all." Sophia smiled faintly. "She's like you in that, quiet when she needs to be, and brave when it matters." He looked at her. "I missed so much." "We both did," she whispered. "But you're here now." They didn't talk about what had separated them. Time, missed messages, mistakes. There would be time for that later. For now, they just sat in silence, as if afraid that words might shatter the fragile peace that was beginning to form between them. The next morning, Christian was making breakfast. He burned the eggs, spilled the orange juice, and accidentally set off the fire alarm. Lily found it terribly funny. Sophia, sitting at the table, laughed until she coughed, and for a moment, the room felt like a place where a family had always lived. That day, the doctors arrived. They examined Sophia gently, respectfully, and Christian made sure she didn't sign a single document. He wanted her to focus on recovery, not on bills and insurance. The diagnosis hadn't changed. She still required long-term care, but now the treatment was top-notch, and more importantly, she no longer had to go through it alone. Christian began to reorganize everything. His schedule changed. He canceled trips, delegated more tasks. His longtime assistant Grace called and cautiously asked, "Is the world ending?" "No," he replied, looking out the window at the backyard where Lily was inventing a game with sticks and pine cones. "It's just beginning." Grace paused, then said, "Quiet, you sound different." "I feel different," he admitted. In the evenings, they sat together. Christian read fairy tales aloud, sometimes mixing up the characters' voices, which made Lily cry with laughter. Sophia slowly began to regain her strength. She could walk short distances around the house, sat on the porch with a blanket, and started keeping a diary. One day, Christian found her writing. She looked up and smiled. "I'm not just surviving anymore. I'm remembering who I am." Christian didn't answer immediately. He just looked at her with admiration. The woman he had lost, the child he had never known, the home he didn't know existed but had become essential, all under one roof. It was fragile, yes, but incredibly real. And for a man who had built a life on logic, control, and distance, this truth became the strongest foundation he had ever known. In the following weeks, the house began to feel less like a temporary refuge and more like something greater, a warm, real place where shoes were left by the door and laughter echoed from the kitchen. Not the sound of wealth, but the sounds of people getting used to life with each other. Christian had never lived like this before. His homes had always been impeccably clean, quiet, precise down to the last vase or unopened bookshelf. And now, art supplies on the dining table, tiny socks in the laundry, children's shows in the background. Lily was like a force of nature, gentle and unassuming, yet leaving her mark everywhere. She didn't need permission to be part of this life. She already was. Sophia, though recovering, was doing so faster than the doctors expected. The treatment was working, but more importantly, her stress levels had dramatically decreased. Christian provided her with everything she needed: medications, private physical therapy, time for herself. He set up a quiet reading nook for her in the sunroom, with the same poetry collections she had loved in college. He even found a rare first edition of her favorite author. The day she found it on the armchair, wrapped in linen and tied with a ribbon, she cried, not for the gift itself, but because someone remembered. For Christian, everything was new. He was used to results, schedules, decisions, and now he was learning to be present. He realized that teaching Lily to tie her shoelaces took more time than signing a multi-million-dollar contract. that bedtime stories required patience, that it was okay to get character voices wrong and laugh at himself. It humbled him like nothing else, but it didn't weaken him. It gave him something more than control, meaning. Sometimes, when Sophia felt better, they would sit together on the back porch after Lily was asleep, talking quietly. Not about business or affairs, but about the past, the missed years, how their lives had diverged and converged again. Christian had questions. He wanted to know everything she had gone through, what she had felt, why she hadn't told him. Sophia answered honestly, even if it was painful. She talked about nights working 2 jobs, about almost fainting on the bus from hunger after giving her food to Lily. She admitted there were times she wanted to call, to cry for help, but each time she talked herself out of it, convincing herself he was gone forever. "I watched an interview with you on TV," she said quietly one night. "You looked alien, sharp, strong, unreachable. I didn't know how to fit back into that world." "You didn't have to," Christian replied, looking at her not with pity, but with something deeper. "That world wasn't real without you." She didn't answer immediately, but reached for his hand and squeezed it tightly, not as a gesture of love, but as a sign of understanding, of forgiveness. Meanwhile, Lily grew more accustomed. She started calling Christian Daddy without prompting, simply handing him a drawing one day. He nearly dropped his coffee when he heard it. He didn't correct her, didn't ask questions, just carefully folded the paper and smiled so gently he surprised himself. The drawing showed the 3 of them holding hands under a huge sun, with one word written above their heads in crooked blue letters: family. That evening, Christian tucked her into bed and sat by her side longer than usual. She asked, "Will you be here in the morning?" He answered without hesitation, "Always." And he meant it not as a promise, but as a choice. For the first time in his life, Christian Blake wasn't chasing the next goal, a deal or a title. He chose something harder, to be a father, a partner, a man who comes when needed. He built empires, yes, but now he was building something more fragile and infinitely more valuable. He was building a life. The first test of this new life came not in the form of illness or legal complexities, but in an unexpectedly ordinary event, a parent-teacher conference at Lily's kindergarten. Christian had never been to such events. The invitation arrived in Lily's backpack, a crumpled paper with crayon marks and crumbs. Sophia was resting that day after a difficult procedure, and Christian volunteered to go in her place, thinking it would be a simple formality. He wore a dark blue sweater instead of a suit, left his phone in the car, and arrived 10 minutes early, not knowing where to stand or what to say. He wasn't used to fluorescent lights and bulletin boards with children's paper handprints. He didn't know how to make small talk with other parents or sit on tiny chairs without looking ridiculous. When the teacher, Miss Howard, greeted him with a warm smile and pointed to a seat, Christian awkwardly folded himself into seating clearly not designed for a man nearly 2 meters tall. She opened a folder labeled Lily Blake and began to talk about her progress, how she was quiet but observant, how she helped other children put away toys without being asked, how she once gave her snack to a classmate who had forgotten theirs. Christian listened attentively, focused, as if in a business presentation. But as the teacher continued, she lowered her voice slightly. "She told me something last week," Miss Howard said softly, tapping her fingers on the edge of the folder. "She said her daddy used to live in the clouds, but he came down when she called him. That's how she described it." Christian froze. He didn't know what to say. A lump formed in his throat. "I just thought you should know," the teacher added. "Everything you've done for her is working. She feels safe, and that's more important than any grades or behavior charts." When he returned home that day, Christian sat in his car for a long time, looking at the house that had once seemed just a building. Now it felt like something alive, like the breath of those inside. Lily ran out to meet him, with a paint smudge on her cheek and a half-untied ribbon in her hair. She hugged his leg as if she had been waiting all day, and when he picked her up, she rested her head on his shoulder, saying nothing. He held her tight, gently cupping the back of her head, inhaling the scent of crayons and apple juice. Inside the house, Sophia felt better. She sat at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and some papers in front of her, forms for a writing program she had been considering. She looked up as he entered and immediately read the expression on his face. "What happened?" she asked softly. He carefully placed Lily on the sofa, letting her get her toys, then turned to Sophia. His voice was filled with almost reverence. She said, "I came down from the clouds." Sophia blinked. "She said that?" He nodded, sitting next to her. "I never thought I'd be a safe harbor for anyone." "You were for her," Sophia said, taking his hand. "Even when you weren't around, she felt you." Christian looked down, overwhelmed by the significance of who he was becoming, not because he doubted, but because it mattered so much, and because for the first time in his life, he was beginning to feel worthy of it. Later that week, Sophia had a follow-up appointment. This time, Christian went with her not just as support, but as a partner. They sat side by side in the waiting room, flipping through old magazines and exchanging quiet jokes. When her name was called, he helped her up and walked with her into the doctor's office. The doctor, kind but straightforward, gave them cautious reason for optimism. The tumor had shrunk. The body was responding. If things continued this way, a second round of intensive therapy might not be necessary. Sophia let out a shaky breath, leaning back in her chair, her eyes filling with tears, a mix of exhaustion and relief. Christian exhaled too, as if the air had been knocked out of him. "You'll make it," he said more to himself than to her. Outside in the parking lot, under a wide gray sky, Sophia looked up at him and said,
"I didn't think I'd ever be able to hope for anything again."
He looked at her and replied,
"Now you have a future, and I want to be in it."
That evening they cooked dinner together, or rather, Christian tried, and Sophia, sitting on a stool, laughed when he oversalted the pasta and spilled half the sauce. Lily sat at the table, drawing another picture, the three of them with hearts above their heads. She handed it to Christian with a serious expression and said,
"This is for your office, so you don't forget us when you're working."
He looked at the drawing, then at the child in front of him, then at the woman across the kitchen, and felt something he had never experienced before. A peace that came not from achievement, but from presence. He carefully folded the paper and put it in his briefcase, not because he might forget, but because he didn't want to forget what was truly important. Autumn arrived quietly, touching the city with faded light and cool evenings. The trees around Christian's house began to blush orange and red. Lily, forever curious, collected leaves during walks and hid them between the pages of her coloring books. Life in the house began to find its own rhythm, no longer driven by emergencies or adaptations, but filled with small, soft, routine moments. Mornings were filled with quiet conversations, toast, and an occasional spilled juice. Afternoons were brightened by laughter from the backyard, where Christian had finally agreed to build a small wooden playhouse, mostly because Lily had asked so sweetly he couldn't refuse. And in the evenings, as the sun dipped behind the trees, the three gathered for dinner, sometimes messy, but always real. Sophia continued to recover. She could now walk without support, slowly ascending the stairs, but with growing confidence. Her cheeks had regained their color, and her voice, once weakened by fatigue, began to regain its natural strength. She spoke openly, laughed freely, and even started writing again. Christian converted one of the guest rooms into a small study for her. He filled it with journals, books, and a view of the garden that always calmed her. It became her space, a place where she could rediscover parts of herself that the illness had tried to erase. One day she told him that being in that room felt like remembering who she was before everything became about survival. Christian, meanwhile, changed in ways no one from his old world could have imagined. He still worked, of course, but without obsession, keeping meetings short, declining night calls, and completely disconnecting on weekends. His assistant, Grace, stopped asking if he was okay, and instead began sending articles about parenting and notes like, "Lily has a field trip. Don't miss it." He appreciated it more than he showed. One evening, after Lily had fallen asleep and the house settled into night's quiet, Christian walked into the study and saw Sophia in the armchair, an open journal on her lap. Tears quietly streamed down her cheeks. She tried to hide it, quickly wiping her face, but he sat down beside her without a word. After a few moments, she whispered that she still sometimes woke up in fear that it was all temporary, that one bad scan could ruin everything, that Christian might one day realize this life was too small for him. He raised his hand and gently touched her face, looking into her eyes with a certainty that left no room for doubt. He told her that nothing about this was small, that she and Lily had given his life a meaning that no success could provide. He said he wouldn't leave, not now, not ever, and if fear returned, they would face it together. She didn't answer immediately, but the way she leaned into him said more than any words. Later that week, something unexpected happened. Christian received a call from a non-profit organization that provided housing and legal aid to single mothers. They had heard about his recent anonymous donations and invited him to speak at their winter gala. At first he refused. He wasn't ready to tell the world what had happened and what had changed. But Sophia convinced him. She said that this story was no longer just his, and that if it inspired even one person to help another, it would be worth it. He agreed. On the evening of the gala, Christian stood on a modest stage in a small hall, in a simple suit, without a tie. He had no prepared speech. He spoke from memory, from the heart. He told them about a little girl who had walked into his office one morning and asked if she could buy a daddy. He told how that moment had shattered everything he thought about life, and how he had rediscovered a love he believed was forever lost. He spoke of the quiet strength of the woman who had raised their daughter alone, and how love had re-entered his life through a second chance he never expected. When he finished, the room was silent. No applause, no movement, just the genuine silence of people who had felt something real. And then, the applause began. Quiet at first, then louder. It wasn't just for him, it was for hope, for change, for redemption. Later, back home, Christian saw Sophia by the door, quiet pride in her eyes. Lily was already asleep, but they stood in the hallway in silence for a long time. Christian pulled her close, his voice quiet and firm. "Thank you for believing I could be more than I was." Sophia smiled, rested her forehead against his, and replied, "Thank you for becoming exactly who we needed." That night, as the snow fell softly outside and the world continued on, their home remained filled with warmth, stories of second chances, and in the silence between words, something unsaid found a permanent place. They were no longer rebuilding. They were already whole. Spring returned slowly, melting the cold and silence, and with it came the feeling that life was no longer being rebuilt. It was simply being lived. The trees behind the Blake house were covered in delicate pink blossoms, the air filled with the scent of damp earth and new beginnings, and laughter returned to the garden, as if it had been waiting all winter for permission. Lily had grown, her shoes no longer slipping off her heels, and her drawings became more detailed, brighter, and more often featured four figures: herself, Mommy, Christian, and a small child with a sun-sized smile. She began to ask, with the straightforwardness only children possess, if they could give her a baby brother or sister. Christian nearly choked on his tea when she first asked, but Sophia just laughed, her eyes shining as they hadn't in a year. The rhythms of their life became steady, but far from routine. In their chaos was warmth, in their imperfection, comfort. Christian continued to divide his time between work and home, but everyone at his company had long accepted that his priorities had changed. He became the leader who left early for school plays, scheduled meetings around doctor's visits, and once interrupted a shareholder call because Lily wanted to show him a butterfly she had caught in the garden. Strangely, the company had never performed better. He no longer micromanaged every step because he no longer felt the need to prove something every second. He had nothing left to prove. Sophia returned to writing with powerful grace. Her essays on motherhood, resilience, and unexpected salvation began to circulate online, attracting attention with their honesty and inner beauty. A small publishing house offered her a book contract, and when she showed it to Christian, his hands trembled slightly, not from anxiety, but from pride. He said it was just the beginning. She replied that she already had everything she needed. The manuscript grew page by page between naps, evening walks, and coffee cups grown cold from distraction. Lily sat nearby, drawing or asking questions about the plot. Sophia smiled and answered each one, never brushing her off, even if her thoughts were deep in editing. One Sunday morning, under the soft sun and scattered petals, Christian took them to the park. The same one he had passed 1,000 times but never entered, too busy, too detached. But that day, they brought a blanket, a picnic basket, and no plans. Sophia lay in the grass with her eyes closed, soaking in the sun, while Lily chased ducks by the pond. Christian sat watching them, and the burden of his former life receded further and further. He used to think peace was boring. Now he knew it was the most extraordinary thing he had ever felt. Later, as the sky turned orange and the air grew cooler, they walked home slowly. Lily skipped between them, holding their hands. She began humming a song she had made up, and Christian listened, catching the words. It sang of discoveries, of families you didn't know you had, and of daddies who came down from the clouds. He looked at Sophia. She was already looking at him. She mouthed silently, "A miracle," and he didn't argue. As they approached the house, Sophia stopped at the door. She looked at Christian and after a long breath asked if he still wanted what they had talked about many months ago, something permanent, something legal, something that would formalize on paper what was already true in their hearts. Christian didn't answer with words. He simply took a small box from his jacket pocket. He didn't know when the moment would come, but he knew it would. Inside was a ring, simple and elegant, unadorned, like her. Sophia didn't cry immediately. She took his face in her hands and kissed him once, softly, as if sealing a promise. Lily clapped her hands on the steps, not fully understanding, but sensing that it was something big and beautiful. That evening at dinner, they told stories of the past and dreams of the future, and it seemed the walls of the house listened, carefully holding these memories within them. A few months later, the wedding was quiet, with only close friends. The backyard was decorated with string lights, and Lily scattered petals with indescribable delight. Sophia wore a dress she chose herself, nothing fancy, just something that made her feel strong and beautiful. Christian, in a custom gray suit, looked at her as if the world had finally made sense. They exchanged vows, not written by someone else, but spoken in their imperfect but honest words. And when the ceremony ended, and Christian lifted Lily into his arms for their first dance together, there wasn't a dry eye left. The life they had built was not born from perfection. It was sculpted from missed chances, broken roads, and pain that still lingered in quiet corners. But it was also built on forgiveness, on presence in the most important moments, on a love that chose to stay, even when it had every reason to leave. Christian once believed happy endings were for others, but now he knew. True happiness is not the end of a story. It's the part you diligently build after all the chapters where everything could have fallen apart. And this imperfect, beautiful, everyday life was precisely the ending he never knew he deserved. The power of this story's conclusion lies not in everything being perfect, but in everything being authentic. It's not about erasing the past, but about healing. What makes this resolution meaningful is the absence of dramatic twists and grand gestures. Everything is built on quiet, steady love and the slow rebuilding of trust and connection. The millionaire CEO doesn't just find a daughter. He finds an image of the man he wants to be, and this transformation feels earned. The beauty lies in how brokenness was allowed to heal, without pretending it was never broken. Sophia's forgiveness wasn't instant, nor was Christian's growth easy. This realism adds emotional depth to their reunion. And Lily, the innocent thread connecting them, reminds us that hope often comes from the most unexpected voices. In the end, this story is about second chances, not those given freely, but those fought for. And in that struggle, a new kind of wealth is found: family, love, and what money cannot buy.